It was one of those hot, sticky afternoons in June when the air felt heavy enough to slow down time itself. The streets of Maple Ridge, a small town in rural Georgia, were quiet except for the low hum of cicadas and the occasional thump of a screen door closing. The First Central Bank sat right in the middle of Main Street, its tall windows reflecting the washed-out blue of the sky. It was the kind of place that had stood for so long, people forgot it could ever change. The red brick was chipped, the white trim faded, but the inside smelled of polished wood and money. A place where everyone came to prove they were doing fine, even when they weren't. Inside, the bank workers moved through their routines like clockwork. Mary Thompson, the branch manager, had her hair pinned perfectly and her smile fixed in place. She was proud of that smile. It made people trust her, made them believe she knew what she was doing. She didn't. Not entirely. Behind that calm expression was a woman terrified of losing control, of her job, her reputation, her place in this quiet, judgmental town. The tellers, too, wore their routines like armor. There was Bobby, the new guy with slick hair who thought a pressed shirt could hide his nervousness. There was Linda, who'd been there for 20 years and counted every dollar like she was weighing her own life. Outside, the town looked peaceful, but anyone who lived there knew peace was just another word for silence. People didn't talk about their problems here. They hid them behind tidy lawns and polite smiles. Maple Ridge had its secrets. It always had. But no one expected that an old man with a burlap sack slung over his shoulder would be the one to pull those secrets out into the open. His name was Earl Jenkins, though most people didn't know that at first. They just saw him as that old black man with the sack, the one who walked slowly down Main Street every morning, stopping sometimes to rest his legs by the fountain. He wore the same faded overalls and sun-bleached cap, his skin darkened by decades under the Georgia sun. People didn't pay much attention to him. Some even laughed when they saw him shuffle past the bank, like he had business there. "Ain't got a dime to his name," one of the younger men once said, watching Earl lean on his cane. But that day, on that June afternoon, he walked into the bank with that same sack over his shoulder and said something that made everyone stop what they were doing. "I'm here to check on my bank," he said. His voice was quiet, rough like sandpaper, but it carried across the tiled floor. The tellers looked at each other. Mary blinked, confused, thinking maybe she had misheard. Earl just stood there, steady, his eyes on her. Before that day, nobody really cared where Earl came from. He lived on the edge of town in a broken-down house behind the old cotton mill. Folks said he'd worked there back in the day before it shut down, before the company left, and the jobs went with it. Others said he was a war veteran, that he'd once gone up north and come back with crazy stories about rich folks and city lights. He kept to himself mostly. People liked it that way. Life in Maple Ridge moved slowly. The bank was the heart of it all, the one place that never seemed to change no matter how many farms went under or how many kids left for Atlanta. It was where old men came to cash their checks and gossip, where farmers came with dirt still on their boots, and where women like Mary tried to keep up appearances. Everyone depended on it. So when the old man claimed it was his, the laughter that followed wasn't just mockery. It was defense. It was disbelief wearing the mask of humor. "Your bank?" Bobby said, his smirk sharp as a paper cut. "You mean your account, right, sir?" Earl didn't smile. He didn't even flinch. "No," he said, slow and calm. "My bank." The air seemed to tighten. The sound of the ceiling fan faded behind the uneasy murmurs. People inside thought he was senile, maybe drunk. But there was something in his eyes, something that made the laughter die down faster than it started. In the days before that moment, Maple Ridge was its usual self, predictable, dull, and quietly divided. There were the folks who owned things and those who worked for them. People didn't talk about race out loud, but it hung in the air like humidity, thick, uncomfortable, and always present. Earl was a reminder of something everyone wanted to forget, that there had been a time when the line between who could own and who couldn't wasn't written in money, but in skin. Still, nobody expected him to do more than talk. They thought he'd leave after the laughter settled. He didn't. He stood there in that quiet, air-conditioned room, his sack resting at his feet, and said something else that turned unease into silence. "I got papers," he said. "Been keeping them safe a long time." No one knew it yet, but that sentence would tear the town apart. Because behind that wrinkled face and slow walk was a man who had waited decades to be heard. And behind those Ed Bank walls were secrets buried deep, some older than anyone alive, some signed with names the town would rather keep forgotten. Outside, the wind started to pick up, swirling dust along Main Street. The sunlight dimmed behind thickening clouds. It wasn't just another summer day anymore. Something had shifted in the air. Something small, but certain. By the time the storm rolled in that evening, the story of the old man with the sack would already be spreading from the diner to the church pews, whispered in disbelief, twisted by rumor. And before long, everyone in Maple Ridge would wish they had listened to the first time he said those words, "It's my bank." After that day, nothing in Maple Ridge felt the same. The moment Earl Jenkins walked into the First Central Bank and claimed it as his, a quiet unease began to spread through the town like a slow-moving storm. At first, people laughed it off, saying the old man had finally lost his mind. But the laughter didn't last, because Earl came back the next day, and the day after that, always carrying that same worn sack, always asking to see his papers. Mary Thompson didn't know what to do with him. She tried to be polite at first, smiling through clenched teeth and telling him to take a seat while she looked into it. But each visit made her more nervous. He wasn't threatening, he never raised his voice, but there was something about the calm way he looked at her that made her uneasy, like he knew something she didn't. Behind her professional smile, Mary's world was already cracking. The bank had been struggling for months. The regional office had started asking questions about missing funds, small amounts at first, just enough to draw suspicion, but not enough to call the police. And Mary knew exactly where they'd gone. She'd been moving money around to cover up mistakes, mostly to protect the bank's image, and her own. She told herself it was temporary. She'd fix it. But she hadn't. When Earl appeared, claiming ownership, her first thought wasn't about him being crazy. It was fear. Fear that somehow he'd found out about her mess. On the third day, he came in just before closing. The bank was quiet, the other tellers already counting their drawers. He walked straight to Mary's desk. "Miss Thompson," he said, his hat clutched in one hand. "You find what I asked for?" Mary looked up, forcing a smile. "Mr. Jenkins, I told you we don't have any record." He interrupted her, his voice steady. "You do, just not where you're looking." The words hung in the air. She didn't know how to respond. Earl reached into his sack and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed and fragile. He laid it on her desk like a challenge. It wasn't a modern document. It looked ancient, the ink faded, the handwriting careful and deliberate. Across the top, in uneven script, it read, "Deed of ownership." Mary's heart started pounding. "Where did you get this?" she asked. Earl looked at her without blinking. "My granddaddy left it to me. He built this place before they took it." That night, Mary sat at her kitchen table with a glass of wine, staring at the copy she'd secretly made of the document. It couldn't be real. Could it? If it was, everything the bank stood on, her job, her reputation, the town's entire history, was built on a lie. She wanted to believe it was nonsense, some old piece of paper Earl had dug, up to make a point. But deep down, something about it felt true. Word about Earl's claim spread fast. By the end of the week, the whole town was talking. At the diner, at church, at the barber shop. Everywhere you went, someone was whispering about the crazy old man who says he owns the bank. People took sides. Some thought he was delusional. Others said maybe there was more to it. The town's older residents, especially those who remembered how things used to be, looked uncomfortable. Bobby, the young teller, started making jokes about Earl every time he came in. "Careful," he'd say to customers, "he might buy the whole place out." But when Earl looked at him, Bobby couldn't hold his gaze for long. There was a weight behind those old eyes, a quiet knowing that made Bobby's laughter fade. Behind the scenes, the tension grew sharper. The bank's board got involved, demanding answers. Mary was called into meetings she didn't want to attend, and questioned about why this man was being allowed to disturb business. She tried to assure them it was nothing. But privately she started digging into the bank's archives, hoping to find something, anything, to prove Earl wrong. What she found only made things worse. The bank's oldest records were missing, entire ledgers from the 1930s and 440s gone. She asked around quietly, but no one could explain it. An elderly clerk who'd retired years ago told her something odd over the phone. "You ain't gonna find what you're looking for, dear. Some things in this town were never meant to be written down." Meanwhile, Earl kept showing up. He wasn't just visiting anymore, he was watching. People noticed him sitting across the street, under the shade of the old oak, just watching the building. It made some of them uncomfortable. A few townsfolk complained to the sheriff, but when Deputy Harris went to talk to Earl, he came back looking troubled. "He's not crazy," he said quietly to Mary afterward. "He's got papers, and they look damn old. I think he believes every word." For Earl, every visit to the bank was more than just persistence. It was justice long delayed. His grandfather, Henry Jenkins, had once been one of the few black men in town to own land, back when that kind of thing drew attention nobody wanted. The story had been buried over generations, smothered under polite silence and rewritten history. But Earl remembered the stories his father told, about how Henry had been tricked, how the land had been seized after a fire destroyed his records, how the new owners made it legal with forged signatures. And now that very land was where the bank stood. The more he dug into the past, the angrier he became. He found old letters in a rusted box, half-burnt deeds, even a faded photograph of his grandfather standing in front of what looked like the same red brick building. Every discovery added fuel to something that had been smouldering in him for years, a quiet rage, sharpened by a lifetime of being ignored. Mary, meanwhile, was unraveling. The late nights, the missing money, the constant pressure from the board. It was too much. Her assistant Linda started noticing the tremor in her hands, the way she jumped at sudden sounds. One evening, Linda found her sitting alone in her office, staring at Earl's copy of the deed. "You should just let it go," Linda said softly. "He's old. Let him believe what he wants." Mary shook her head. "You don't understand. If this is real, none of this is ours. None of it ever was." Outside forces made everything worse. The regional bank was planning an inspection. Rumors about financial irregularities were circulating. And then a local reporter, Sam Dillard, got wind of Earl's claim. Sam was known for stirring trouble. He loved exposing small-town hypocrisy. When he showed up at the bank with his notepad, Mary nearly threw him out. But he managed to talk to Earl first, and his article in the Maple Ridge Gazette changed everything. The headline read, "Local Man Claims Bank Built on Stolen Land." That morning, the phones rang non-stop. Customers came in to withdraw their money. Board members showed up demanding damage control. Mary's boss called from Atlanta, furious. And through it all, Earl sat outside the bank, calm as ever, his sack beside him, watching the chaos unfold. Bobby started whispering that maybe Mary was hiding something. Linda overheard him telling a customer that the boss lady's got more to lose than she lets on. The gossip spread faster than the truth could catch up. By the end of that week, trust in the bank was gone. The confrontation everyone had been dreading finally came on a humid Friday afternoon. Mary called Earl into her office. She looked exhausted. Her eyes red, her blouse wrinkled. "Mr. Jenkins," she said, her voice shaking, "I've looked at your papers. I can't find anything in our records to confirm your claim." Earl leaned forward. "That's 'cause your records ain't complete." Mary's jaw tightened. "Even if what you're saying was true, it wouldn't matter anymore. The statute of limitations—" Earl cut her off. "So you admit it?" The silence after that felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. She didn't answer. Couldn't. He stood, collected his paper, and left without another word. From that point, things moved fast and ugly. The sheriff's office opened a quiet inquiry after Sam's follow-up article claimed the bank was suppressing old land documents. Town meetings turned into shouting matches. White business owners blamed Earl for stirring trouble. Some even suggested he was being used by outsiders, but others, especially younger residents, began to question the history they'd been taught. At night, Mary started seeing shadows outside her window. She told herself it was just her nerves, but part of her feared someone was watching. When she arrived at the bank one morning to find the door unlocked and her office drawer pried open, she knew things had gone too far. She suspected Bobby, who'd been acting strange lately. He'd asked too many questions about the missing records. But when she confronted him, he turned it back on her. "You're the one hiding something, Mary," he said coldly. "Maybe the old man's right." It was all unraveling. Her job, her sanity, her carefully built world. The air around the bank grew tense, heavy with mistrust. Customers whispered in the lobby. Earl kept coming, quieter now, but with a look in his eyes that made people uneasy. He wasn't begging anymore. He was waiting. Some nights he'd sit on his porch, listening to the crickets, clutching the sack that held everything he had left of his family's truth. And he'd think about the faces that had laughed at him, dismissed him, told him to move along. He wasn't a violent man, but anger had a way of changing what a person thought they were capable of. By the time the storm hit, both the one in the sky and the one about to break inside the bank, everyone in Maple Ridge had picked a side. Some wanted Earl gone, some wanted justice, and a few just wanted to survive whatever was coming. And deep down, every one of them could feel it, the sense that something irreversible was about to happen. The fragile calm that had held the town together for decades was cracking, and once it broke, there'd be no going back. It happened on a Thursday. The air that morning was thick and wet, the kind of humidity that made the sky look bruised before the storm even started. The town had been holding its breath for weeks, waiting for something to break. And that day, it finally did. Earl Jenkins woke before dawn. He didn't sleep much anymore. The sleepless nights had turned his thoughts into loops, old memories mixing with new anger, past injustices twisting into something sharper. He sat at his kitchen table, the sack on the floor beside him, his papers spread out in front of him like a battlefield map. His hands trembled slightly as he touched them, tracing the names, the ink that had faded but never disappeared. His grandfather's handwriting stared back at him, and in that quiet house, with the sound of rain beginning to patter against the roof, Earl made up his mind. He was done talking. The bank opened at 9, but by 8:30 a crowd had already gathered outside. The story had gone viral after another article hit the internet the night before. Someone had leaked the deed online, and people were furious. Some came to support Earl. Others came to watch him fail. The police stood nearby, trying to keep order, but the air was buzzing with tension. Mary arrived through the back door, avoiding the crowd. She hadn't slept either. Her eyes were bloodshot, her blouse damp with sweat, and in her purse was a gun she'd taken from her late husband's drawer that morning. She told herself it was only for protection. The threats had started coming in after the article, angry calls, anonymous notes, even a rock thrown through her window. She couldn't risk something happening inside the bank, not today. By 9 the storm had rolled in. The clouds opened up, turning Main Street into a blur of umbrellas and dripping coats. Earl stepped through the front doors just as thunder cracked overhead. He didn't flinch. He looked calm, focused, his sack slung over his shoulder. He didn't look like a man walking into trouble. He looked like a man walking into the truth. Mary saw him from across the lobby. Her heart jumped. "Mr. Jenkins," she said, her voice tighter than she meant it to be. "Please, not today. A lot is going on." He ignored her. He walked straight toward her office, the crowd outside pressing against the glass to see. Linda tried to stop him, but he brushed past. Inside, the lights flickered as the storm roared louder. The room felt smaller than usual, the air heavier. Earl dropped the sack on the floor. "You've had time," he said quietly. "You've seen the papers. I want my land back." Mary's fingers trembled as she gripped the edge of her desk. "It's not that simple," she whispered. "Even if your papers were real, the law—" "The law," Earl cut in. "The law that took everything from my family and called it fair." His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that made the room tremble. Outside, thunder boomed again, shaking the windows. The sound made Mary flinch. "Please," she said, her voice cracking, "you don't understand what this means. You'll ruin everything." Earl stared at her, rainwater dripping from his coat. "Everything's already been ruined," he said. "Just not for you." The argument grew sharper. Voices rose. Linda knocked on the door, asking if everything was okay, but Mary barked for her to stay out. When Linda hesitated, Bobby came up behind her, trying to listen. Neither of them realized they were about to witness something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Inside the office, Earl reached into his sack. Mary's breath caught. Her hand instinctively went to her purse. Earl pulled out the old papers again, laying them on the desk. "Here," he said, his voice breaking for the first time. "You look. You tell me what it says." Mary's hand shook as she reached for the document, but her fear had already turned to panic. She thought of the missing money, the board's warnings, the reporters waiting outside, and now this. An old man tearing apart what little control she had left. Her hand brushed the cold metal inside her purse. "Put that away," Earl said softly. His eyes dropped to her trembling hand. "Don't make this worse." "I can't," she whispered. "You don't know what's at stake." He took a step closer, his voice low but steady. "What's at stake is what's right." Lightning flashed outside, blinding for a split second, and in that brief white light, everything fell apart. A gunshot cracked through the storm. The sound echoed down the marble halls, cutting through the noise of rain and thunder. People screamed. Linda dropped the stack of files in her hands. Bobby froze. The crowd outside pressed harder against the glass as police rushed forward. Inside the office, Earl fell backward, the papers scattering around him like dying birds. The gun clattered from Mary's shaking hand onto the floor. For a long, awful second, there was silence, just the steady patter of rain and the faint hiss of the air conditioner. Then she dropped to her knees beside him, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Oh God," she whispered over and over. "Oh God, what did I do?" Earl's eyes were open, his lips moving faintly. "My bank," he managed to say. Then his chest went still. The door burst open. Linda screamed when she saw the blood. Bobby backed away, white as a ghost. Two officers rushed in, shouting orders, their boots slapping against the tile. One of them grabbed Mary, pulling her up as she cried out, her hands covert in red. "I didn't mean to," she shouted. "He came at me. He... But her words stumbled into sobs. The officers didn't answer. They just looked down at Earl, his papers soaked in blood, the ink bleeding into the floor. Outside, the crowd erupted. Some shouted for justice, others for calm. The sheriff arrived minutes later, his face pale when he saw who was on the ground. The rain poured harder, washing over the windows, as if the sky itself wanted to drown the sound of what had just happened. Inside, chaos reigned. Reporters swarmed the scene. The bank staff were ushered out. Mary sat in a chair, her hands trembling, her blouse stained, her mind spinning so fast she couldn't tell what was real anymore. She kept saying it over and over. "He reached for something. I thought he had a gun. I didn't mean to." But everyone who had been outside the door knew what they'd heard. A single voice pleading, and another one breaking. Hours later, the storm finally passed, leaving the town soaked and silent. The police carried Earl's body out on a stretcher, the sack still lying by his side. Someone had covered his face with a white sheet, but the papers, the ones he'd fought so hard to protect, were ruined, the ink smeared, the edges torn. Whatever proof he'd held onto for decades was now little more than a memory. Mary sat in the back of the patrol car, staring out the window at the bank. For a moment she saw her reflection in the glass, but it didn't look like her anymore. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow. She tried to replay the moment, to convince herself it had been self-defense. But deep down, she knew it hadn't been. She hadn't pulled the trigger because she was afraid of dying. She'd pulled it because she was afraid of losing everything else. As the police car pulled away, the townspeople stood in the rain, watching silently. No one spoke. They all felt it. The shift, the crack in tea, the illusion of peace they'd lived under for so long. The old man was gone, but what he'd started wasn't. The truth he'd carried in that sack didn't die with him. It lingered in the air, heavy and unspoken, waiting to come back in ways no one expected. And in that silence, the town of Maple Ridge finally began to realize what kind of place it really was. The storm outside had ended, but the one inside had only just begun. The morning after the shooting, Maple Ridge was quiet in a way that didn't feel like peace. It felt like shame. The rain had washed away the blood from the bank's steps, but not the heaviness it left behind. The people moved more slowly that day. Conversations that once filled the diner or the post office stopped when someone mentioned Earl Jenkins' name. The old man who used to be invisible had become the center of everything, even in death. Mary Thompson spent that first night in a holding cell. She didn't sleep. She sat on the metal bench with her arms wrapped around herself, staring at the grey floor. Every few minutes she'd whisper something under her breath, like she was trying to reason with herself. "He reached for something," she'd say. "He reached first." But the more she repeated it, the less she believed it. Her lawyer came in early the next morning, trying to prepare her for what was coming. "You need to stick to your story," he told her firmly. "You were scared for your life. He was unpredictable. No jury will fault you for defending yourself." Mary nodded, but inside her stomach twisted. The memory wouldn't stop replaying. The look in Earl's eyes, the way his voice broke just before the gun went off. She hadn't seen a weapon. There hadn't been one. But she'd convinced herself he was dangerous, not because of what he did, but because of what he represented. The truth. When the sheriff announced to the press that the shooting had been an unfortunate incident resulting from a misunderstanding, the town split right down the middle. Some people said it was tragic but justified. Others called it murder. The comment sections online were worse. Words like racist, corrupt, and cover-up flooded social media. The story went national within 2 days. Reporters from Atlanta, even New York, came to Maple Ridge. The bank became a crime scene and a symbol all at once. Linda couldn't bring herself to go back to work. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Earl lying on the floor, the papers spread around him like fallen leaves. She started attending church every day, lighting candles for a man she barely knew but couldn't stop thinking about. Guilt settled into her like a sickness. She'd seen Mary's fear growing, heard her say she couldn't take much more. She should have stepped in, should have called someone. but she hadn't. Bobby, on the other hand, didn't feel guilt. He felt anger. He told anyone who'd listened that Mary was being protected because of who she was. "If that had been me who pulled the trigger," he said bitterly one night at the bar, "I'd be in prison by now." He started giving interviews, feeding the reporters every rumor he knew, about the missing funds, about Mary's breakdowns, about how the bank had been a house of lies long before the shooting. For Earl's family, the grief came in waves. His daughter, Ruth, flew down from Chicago for the funeral. She hadn't been back to Maple Ridge in 20 years. She remembered her father's voice over the phone, the way he used to say, "One day the truth's going to come out, baby. I just hope I'm here to see it." She never imagined that truth would cost him his life. The service was small, but people came, some out of love, others out of guilt. The pastor spoke softly, his voice trembling when he said Earl's name. The church was quiet, except for the rain tapping against the windows, as if the world itself hadn't yet dried from the day he died. When the service ended, Ruth stood outside in the drizzle, facing the direction of the bank. "He told y'all who he was," she said to no one in particular, "and y'all laughed." Mary was released on bail, but she might as well have been in prison. Everywhere she went, eyes followed her, some sympathetic, most judgmental. The house she'd once taken pride in now felt cold and foreign. Reporters camped outside her street. She stopped answering the phone. Even her own mother, who'd tried to defend her at first, couldn't look her in the eye anymore. At night, she heard the shot again, over and over. The sound echoed in her chest until she'd wake up gasping. Sometimes she swore she saw him, Earl, standing in the corner of her room, silent, watching her with that same look he gave her before he fell. She started drinking more, taking sleeping pills to make the nights shorter. But the guilt didn't fade. It just sank deeper. Meanwhile, the investigation took a turn when a young journalist named Sam Dillard refused to let the case die. He dug deeper into Earl's claims, finding old property maps, court records, and family testimonies that supported his story. His report, published 3 weeks after the shooting, painted a damning picture. The land under First Central Bank had once belonged to Henry Jenkins, Earl's grandfather, and had been taken through forged documents, and racist laws in the 1920s. When that article hit the front page, the town couldn't ignore it anymore. The truth was out. The bank, the town's pride, had been built on stolen ground. People who'd once dismissed Earl as a crazy old man now called him brave. Vigils were held outside the bank. Protesters demanded Mary's arrest and the board's resignation. The building itself became a symbol of everything wrong with Maple Ridge's past, its silence, its prejudice, its selective memory. For the first time, Mary saw her own reflection in the news, not as the calm, respectable manager she'd always been, but as a face of denial. She wanted to believe she'd only made a mistake. But when she saw that photo, Earl's hand clutching those papers even as he lay dying, something in her broke completely. She stopped trying to defend herself. She stopped talking altogether. By the time her trial came around, months later, she looked like a ghost of the woman she'd been. Thin, pale, her voice barely audible. The courtroom was packed. Ruth sat in the front row, holding one of her father's old photographs. When the prosecutor described how Mary had pulled the trigger on an unarmed man, Ruth didn't cry. She just watched, her face still, her eyes full of everything the town had refused to see. Mary's lawyer argued for manslaughter, saying she'd acted out of fear and confusion. But when Mary finally took the stand, her voice cracked under the weight of what she'd done. "I wasn't afraid of him," she said quietly. "I was afraid of the truth." The courtroom went silent. The judge's gavel came down hard that afternoon. Mary was sentenced to 15 years. Some said it wasn't enough. Others said it was too much. But for most, the punishment didn't feel like justice. It felt like another tragedy in a story that never should have happened. The bank never reopened. The building sat empty, boarded up, its windows collecting dust. People crossed the street to avoid looking at it, as if doing so would make them forget. But they couldn't. Not really. Because the story of Earl Jenkins became part of Maple Ridge's bones, a reminder carved deep into its conscience. Linda eventually moved away, unable to stand the whispers or the nightmares. Bobby quit banking altogether. Ruth used the settlement money from the civil suit to open a small foundation in her father's name, dedicated to helping families reclaim lost land. Every time she spoke at an event, she ended her speech the same way. He wasn't asking for revenge. He was asking to be seen. And in the quiet spaces of that broken town, his voice still lingered, soft, patient, echoing through the rustling trees and empty streets. He had spent his life being ignored, dismissed, and laughed at. But in death, Earl Jenkins had finally made them listen. The rain returned the night the bank's sign was taken down for good. The metal letters clattered to the ground, one by one, the sound echoing through the empty street. Somewhere, far from there, Ruth stood by her window and whispered into the storm, "It's yours now, Daddy. They can't take it anymore." And though the world kept moving, Maple Ridge never really recovered, because deep down, everyone knew that the old man with the sack had been right all along. In the months that followed Mary Thompson's sentencing, Maple Ridge began to look different, not in its buildings or its streets, but in its eyes. People looked at one another longer now, as if searching for something beneath the surface, something they had missed before. The town that had once prided itself on its civility and quiet order was forced to face what lay beneath that order: fear, privilege, and the easy lies people tell themselves to stay comfortable. Mary was transferred to the state correctional facility just outside Birmingham. Her first weeks there passed in silence. She barely spoke, barely ate. The guards said she moved like someone walking through a dream she couldn't wake from. The other inmates didn't bother her much. Most saw in her a kind of tragic figure, someone who had fallen not because of greed or rage, but because of something smaller and sadder: blindness. She spent most of her time in the prison library. There, between the pages of books she'd never cared for before, she found pieces of the world she'd ignored. Histories of land theft, of segregation, of laws twisted to serve those already in power. Every paragraph cuts a little deeper. It was as if she were finally reading the world in a language she'd refused to learn. When Ruth Jenkins wrote her a letter, short, restrained, almost painfully polite, Mary took weeks before finding the courage to open it. It said simply, "I don't forgive you, but I hope you understand now what he was trying to tell you. That's all he ever wanted, to be heard." Mary didn't write back. She folded the letter neatly and kept it inside her Bible. Sometimes she'd take it out and trace the handwriting with her finger, not as a plea for forgiveness, but as an acknowledgement of something she could never undo. Ruth's life, too, became a quiet act of rebuilding. The foundation she started in her father's name began small, just a handful of volunteers and a rented office in Montgomery. But it grew. They helped families track stolen deeds, navigate legal archives, and reclaim what had been lost generations before. Each case felt like a thread tied back to her father's memory, a way to turn his pain into something that healed instead of destroyed. But even in her success, Ruth carried the scar of what happened. Every time she stood in front of a crowd, telling her father's story, her voice trembled slightly on the word justice. Because deep down, she knew no version of justice could give him back what had been taken. Not just his land, but his dignity, his years, his peace. What she sought now wasn't revenge. It was balance. The town's reckoning came slowly. After the article confirming the stolen land, the bank's board members faced an investigation. Some resigned quietly. Others issued public apologies, thinly veiled and self-serving. A new mayor commissioned a Truth and Reconciliation Committee, a phrase that sounded noble on paper but carried little weight. For a few months there were meetings, speeches and talk of change. But by the next election cycle, those efforts faded. Still, something had shifted that couldn't be undone. The children who'd watched the protests, who'd seen the murals of Earl Jenkins painted on the side of the abandoned bank, would grow up knowing his name, not as a whisper of madness, but as a warning and a lesson. Linda, who had moved to Tennessee, found herself unable to escape the past completely. In quiet moments, she still heard the echo of that gunshot. She started writing letters she never sent, one to Mary, one to Ruth, one to the man she'd watched die. "You were right," she wrote in one. "We all knew deep down. We just didn't want to see it." Bobby took his anger and turned it into something almost useful. He started attending town meetings, speaking out against corruption and demanding accountability. For the first time, he wasn't shouting just to be heard. He was trying to build something different. Some nights, he'd drive past the old bank building, still boarded up and covered in ivy, and sit there in silence. "He changed this place," he once said to a friend. Not the way he wanted, maybe, but he did. The bank itself became a kind of monument. The town debated tearing it down, but no one could agree on what to replace it with. Eventually, Ruth's foundation bought the property using settlement funds. The renovation took 2 years. When it reopened, the sign above the door read, "The Jenkins Center for Historical Justice." Inside, the first exhibit was a single display case containing Earl's weathered folder, the same one he'd carried that day. The documents inside, copies of deeds, letters and photographs, told the story he died trying to prove. The plaque beneath it read, "He carried the truth until it carried him." Visitors came from other towns, even other states. Some left flowers, others just stood in silence. Teachers brought students there on field trips, explaining how history could be buried not just in archives, but in people's silence. And yet, even as the story became part of the town's lore, it remained deeply human, messy, imperfect, unresolved. Because what happened in Maple Ridge wasn't just about one shooting or one injustice. It was about what happens when fear becomes habit, when privilege becomes blindness, when truth knocks at the door and no one answers. Was justice served? That question lingered like smoke. Mary paid her price, the town paid its shame, and Ruth built something new out of loss. But the weight of what happened, the moral debt, could never fully be settled. Justice, it turned out, wasn't a verdict. It was a process. The case of Mary Thompson versus the state of Alabama became a brief headline, then a citation in law journals about implicit bias and racial violence. It fueled debates about gun laws, about mental health in the workplace, about race and property rights. Scholars would later call it a turning point in the conversation on systemic restitution. But for those who lived through it, it was never that clean. It was grief. It was silent. It was my memory. And maybe that's where its meaning truly lived. Not in the courtroom or the articles, but in the small, quiet moments afterward, in the way people spoke more carefully, in the way children asked questions adults couldn't easily answer, in the way a town learned painfully that history doesn't stay buried just because it's inconvenient. On the anniversary of the shooting, Ruth stood outside the Jenkins Center, watching candles flicker in the rain. People gathered, black, white, young, old. They didn't all agree on what had happened, but they were there, together, acknowledging it. For the first time, maybe ever, Maple Ridge was listening. As the night grew colder, Ruth whispered her father's words under her breath, the same ones he'd told her long ago. The truth don't die, baby. It just waits. And somewhere in that stillness, between the soft hum of rain and the glow of candlelight, the truth waited no longer. It lived.